Hello and welcome. This is the second WAFX session of the day. WAFX being the name of some awards that we launched to mark World Architecture Festival's 10th anniversary. And it's awards for ideas for future projects which deal with the issues of critical significance to architecture and indeed society as a whole. And this session is about carbon, specification, retrofit and reuse. And I'm going to ask to kick us off Simon Sturgis, an environmental specialist and an architect by background. His consultancy is called Targeting Zero. And Simon actually spoke at the very first World Architecture Festival back in 2008, talking about his investigations into embodied carbon and has pursued that subsequently with very, very interesting research and results. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everybody. So as Paul said, I'm going to be talking about carbon, retrofit and reuse. So all of this really sources back, I suppose, and the point of common reference is Paris 2015 and, of course, more recently, COP26, which has really, I suppose, reinforced COP21, the Paris COP. And the things that have come out of that, like the Sustainable Development Goals and so on, which we are all using or increasingly using. So for the UK, and everybody, most countries have got similar kinds of things, but in the UK, what we have is a government commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. And within that, 78% reductions by 2035, which after all is only 13 years away. And that is a massive reduction. So what does this sort of mean? Now, what we have again in the UK, and I'm assuming this sort of thing is kind of equivalent in most countries, is that this diagram, which has been produced by a combination of the RIBA, Royal Institute of British Architects, LETI, and the GLA, LETI being the London Energy Transformation Initiative and GLA being Greater London Authority, is kind of a description of what we need to do. So on the right of that, you can see a solid curve where the peak today is. So that is where we are, which is not particularly good. And we need to move to the left to achieve 2035. And what that looks like in numbers is more like this. It's you can see at the bottom there, under G is where we were probably about 1990, and we've sort of maybe made some improvement to today, where we've got under those different categories, you can see all those numbers are well over 1,000 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. So that's the kind of intensity of a typical building today. And where we need to get to in the green box is about a third of that by 2035. So that's a massive change. And what do we do? So this is trying to describe this in simple terms. So if you go to the left of this, you can see new build in 1990, the bottom left there, would have been around, as I say, about 1,500 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. And you can see from the big amount of blue above that, that is the, it's obviously mostly to do with new material with a small bit of maybe recycled content. And if you look along the bottom there, as you ramp up the options, so recycled content, reused elements, retained structure, material innovation, and retrofit and just pure maintenance, you can see how, of course, the amount of carbon costly new material is coming down because it has to, and it's being replaced by low carbon or reused or recycled material, which is the green. So the proportion of green is increasing as you move from left to right. And you can see there, retrofit over to the right is not some different thing. It's basically just a part of a line of increasingly recycled content, if you like. So that gives you an idea of the sort of overview of what it might look like to reduce. This is kind of more time-based. So what you're looking at here is each of these 5 yearly sections represents the aggregated or the combined total to that point. And if you look at the first one on the left, you can see in blue the upfront construction emissions. And then at the bottom, you can just see below in that first slot a little sliver of orange, which is the pale orange, which is the operational energy use. And as you move from left to right, you can see each 5 yearly period obviously the initial construction emissions stay the same, but you're starting to get the operational in orange increasing progressively over time in aggregate. And of course, you're starting also to get the embodied coming in terms of maintenance, repair, replacement, and so on. And you can see that over the next 30, 40 years, embodied emissions are the biggest problem from the point of view of a new building. It's not the operational. They are an increasing problem, but they're not the biggest single issue. But if we look at retrofit, and this is the equivalent for retrofit. So retrofit, the initial upfront construction emissions are relatively low, and you can see therefore that they're a much smaller part of the whole picture. And obviously what we're trying to do is move from a linear economy through where we are, I suppose, today, which is a recycling economy, to a circular economy where there's zero waste and we're reusing everything. And this is into which this context, of course, reusing buildings is crucial. So it is about reuse, refurbish, recycle. And I think we've got to realize that we've got to stop demolishing buildings just because we need to get a bit of extra floor space on a site. Many buildings that we demolish are perfectly useful and perfectly viable, but and developers are responsible for this because, of course, they wish to increase the area that which they have on a site, and architects are complicit because, of course, we like to have a shiny new building that we've designed. Of course, looking forward, what we also want to be doing is designing. When we do design new buildings, we want to be designing them from a perspective of durability, adaptability, and flexibility. Are the buildings we're designing today, new buildings that we're designing today, capable of future retrofit, beneficial retrofit, in other words, easy retrofit? So we should be thinking about that. We should be avoiding, if you like, designing highly bespoke buildings which can't change. We should be designing buildings that are capable of future changing of use and adaptation in various other ways, and of course future-proofed against climate change. Now this one is an interesting example. This is a project that we were involved with a few years ago, and the top left there and the bottom right look like the same building, and to an extent they are. And what we did was we took a building that was about to be demolished, persuaded the client to retain it, and it was dismantled and then built again on another site about 3 kilometers away. And by doing that, and of course this is a typology, this is a 2-story office warehouse type thing. It's a typology we find all over Europe, in fact all over the world, as a sort of standard edge of city kind of phenomenon. And by doing this particular project, we were able to reuse about 70% of materials, about 40% reduction in carbon emissions by doing this. And there was a 25% reduction in build costs. So by reusing stuff, it was beneficial all around. And of course, the other thing point to make is that this building was not designed specifically to be dismantled and reused. And if we do design buildings to be dismantled and reused, all those figures above there will get better. So this is another kind of example of, if you like, retrofit in pieces rather than retrofit on a site. And I would suggest that these sorts of buildings this is London, but it could be anywhere. This is London, not today, but it's London about, I think, 10, 20 years in the future, which showing a range of schemes that have yet to be built. But these buildings are fundamentally sort of working against climate change, and they are, the size that they are, you'd expect them to last a century or more. But given that they've got glazed facades, those glazed facades will have to be replaced every 30 to 40 years, which is very high embodied cost. And it's a legacy that if we're building them today, it's a legacy going forward into the future that is a problem for the inheritors of these buildings that are new. And of course, the reason why they are high in embodied carbon is the facades is because to combat to reduce the energy use, they are made up of quite complex sort of sealed units with quite a lot of depth and so on. So we need to be rethinking our architecture from that perspective. And interestingly enough, a client of ours, British Land, which is one of the biggest UK, if not the biggest UK property developer, you see that figure at the top right there, 500 kilograms. That's about getting on for a third of those figures I was showing you earlier. That is what British Land are committing to do by 2030. And what that means for them is they're going to be using a lot of a lot more retrofit, a lot more recycled content, and a lot more innovation. So retrofit is all part of that whole picture. And I think that if you look at where we are today, we have experienced in the Industrial Revolution, between the 18th and 19th centuries and the 19th, 20th centuries, moving from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy, we had massive systemic change. And I would argue that climate crisis is about the same sort of thing, that we've got massive systemic change coming towards us. And we need to really think about how we deal with that and what the architecture of that's going to be like, and how much of that's going to be retrofit, how much of it's going to be innovation, and so on. So that is my last slide. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that, Simon. Canny Ash is going to join us shortly, and she'll be making a presentation. But Simon, maybe I can ask you a question while we just get her tech sorted out, which is to do with the question of increasing population. So just one question before I bring Canny in, but clearly the implications of, shall we say, for the sake of argument, a world population that's going to go up 70, 80%, maybe more by 2050. The implication of that is an enormous wave of housing wherever it might be built. Does this mean that worrying about office buildings in the City of London, while important, is not that important? Or do you think we've just got to tackle this on all fronts?
Well, I think we have to tackle this on all fronts, but I do think that for a start, we have certainly in the UK, and I think it's probably not atypical, is that we have many buildings which are empty or capable of being retrofitted, which are just not. And quite often these are deliberately left to kind of deteriorate so that they can be knocked down. But I think we need to focus on that. Yes, we need to build new buildings. We will have to build new buildings, as you say, because of population growth. But I think we have to really think about how we do that and what they're made of. And as I say, we need to design them we need to future-proof the design such that they are capable of, dealing with climate change, that they're durable, that they last a long time, and that they are capable of future adaptation. I think they've got to be treated as investments for the future, not an investment for today. So I think, yes, we have to tackle these things in all respects. But I think the key point is that I think there's a new architecture on the horizon coming at us, and we don't necessarily know what it is, but it's going to be different.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to introduce Canny Ash, who I've seen in the green room with headphones. So, Canny, okay, we're trying to refresh that page. So, Simon, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you another question, which is whether you see the emergence of modernist architecture as a response to the hideous industrial conditions made in many cities, whether you see the sort of green architecture of today as a new modernism, if you like.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because modernism, of course, came out of the First and Second World Wars as a direct kind of response to the requirements of certainly Europe in dealing with an existential crisis, which was, of course, those two world wars. And of course, we know that a lot of the thinking was done in the 20s. And of course, the speed of innovation was phenomenal. I mean, if you look at the sort of buildings being built before the First World War and the ones that were being built after the end of the First World War, things like the Villa Savoye, Le Corbusier, massive difference in architecture over a very short period of time. Yet the evolution of architecture, I would say, from the sort of 70s through to, let's say, the early 2000s, has been pretty slow and pedestrian. I mean, it hasn't really, we haven't had to respond to a major crisis, and I would suggest that the climate crisis, if you like, is our current existential crisis, and it's a slow-moving one. It's we haven't got bombs raining down, but the implications are no less severe potentially, and I think we therefore will see a change, and it will be. I think the I don't think we've evolved far enough into what the new green architecture is like.
But Simon, your presentation was so sort of provocative that I've got a host of other questions that I could ask here. One of which is...
do cut me off if Canny comes back in.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Oh, great.
I'm so
yes,
sorry.
Canny,
It was working perfectly.
It's fine. Let me introduce you properly. Please welcome Canny Ash, founder partner of Ash Sacular Architects, a practice which is well known not only for the high quality of their design, but for their sort of refreshing approach to kind of the world of bricolage, taking the existing, adding to it, extending it, making the most of what you find. Canny, please give us your presentation and then we'll have some discussion.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. I think it's true that we are architects who are prepared to be slightly more magpie-ish in our approach to aesthetics and opportunistic in order to create value. And I'm going to tell you a story here at high speed, so we've got time for discussion, about a particular place 15 years ago where we had the slightly unusual opportunity to persuade a local authority not to knock down a large 1970s concrete building. And as you know, these types of structures are very vulnerable to fashion, and particularly in a place like Leicester, where they're very proud of their red brick merchant city. This did feel to them like out of place. And the leader of the council kept calling it the public lavatory that had to go. There was nothing to recommend it whatsoever. But and here it is at the back where the buses would drive through that big opening and park at the back. But as would have it, there was some funding which Leicester was going to lose to Nottingham unless they got a planning application in and started on site with a project in this area, which was deemed the sort of the major regeneration part of Leicester, St George's. So we said, give us a chance. Like, we can show how this place can be utterly transformed. And one of the arguments we made was that the fabric, which I'll go into in a minute. But the other thing that was so important is that this was the place that people arrived and departed from Leicester. And anybody who was 30 and over remembered doing that. The building had been empty for 12 years, but it was still very much part of people's kind of memories of how the city worked. And it had a kind of back to the future feeling about it, incredibly proud of the potential of this state-of-the-art bus station when it was built in 1969. And you can see the control room. You can see now how instead of standing out in the cold, sort of hugging a thermos, people were able to come in and socialize and feel part of a team. This was a job for life. This was a place where you would really perform for the city. And when you made it up the rungs of the ladder, you could come to the officer level of the bus station and be in this like really swish place and have drinks after work, or maybe lunches too. And not only that, there was a performance space. You could bring in your families, and there could be, all sorts of events and Christmas plays and that kind of thing. So when we came in 12 years later, it was really dusty and musty, but there were certain moments where you could really feel a human inhabitation, like this place where you could tell people were paid their weekly wages. And we also just loved the fact there was so much space. It felt like a no-brainer to us that this should be the center of what would be Leicester creative business rather than Leicester city buses. So we argued that to the creative community that actually this was a great opportunity because, as Jane Jacobs is now, iconic in saying new ideas need old buildings. And we said also that this was also an aesthetic opportunity, that this was a something for nothing, but it was also a cubist artwork. It was a found object in artistic terms. So we knew that these floor plates were too wide for creative business. But what we suggested doing was cutting into the center so we could get cross ventilation, and it could be turned from a building which was costing the council a lot of money just to mothball into something which was really valuable. Unfortunately, they had the control room on the ground floor and this incredibly massive concrete structure for the safe where they kept the valuable money, right in the center of the plan. But we managed to make that part of the story. And one of the things that made this building work is we said the ground floor is completely part of the city, that is open. If you have a key, a code, you can go up into the upper levels, and that enabled us to make it much more open at the bottom. Here you can see the beams running across where you could hang a swing. They often did. A light well into the separate safe underneath, and this is what happened. I mean, it's no more difficult than drilling up the road for something, and because there's so much steel in this concrete, you didn't even need to trim it. You could just cut those wires and off you went. So in that stead, we got this place which had a lovely kind of way of filtering sunlight, a nice sense of separateness, but also transparency with your neighbors, and studios which were really to die for. You had a space, magnetic walls, you had walls you could staple gun onto, you had a total freedom to control the temperature in your space. So here you can see our imagined spaces, here you can see it in real life. And here I might just describe the fact that when we made these studios, we took the facade out a little bit beyond the structural frame, which allowed us to make more glazing, but more shading and more nighttime cooling with those upper vents, which were on actuators, but then also user control with these little sliding vents, which had a shelf over them and a window you could always open. So there wasn't this centrally controlled thing. And that the concrete chimney that had been there for the boiler room was used for stack ventilation. You can sort of see some of these openings on the outside facing the yard. And this is now a little agricultural farm. It's a hangout. It's a place where lots of events in COVID are taking place. The city got their red brick. We were able to overclad this, and I just have two final slides, which I hope will seed our conversation, which is, this is something we're working with London School of Architecture. It's a building finished in 2019. We're seeing what can be done to think about the obsolescence of this building and pre-plan how we're going to be dealing with the masses of large floor plates coming about in London at the moment. And also with just the question past COP26, how can we carry on ignoring embodied energy, particularly embodied energy, which has so much history and social value? Certainly the LCB depot has led to fewer buildings being knocked down in the area. That's something we could talk about. But I think it's now the center of a hub of spaces and is really valuable. Thank you.
Canny, thank you very much for that. Perhaps I can ask you both to respond to this, but maybe Canny first, actually, which is, when you go to cities, when you start new projects and you look at the circumstances you find, do you, rather like me, always look at the buildings and usually they're environs, and all you can see is wasted space and kind of redundant things which are crying out for some form of reuse? I don't find this to be unusual. I find it to be ubiquitous. Am I right about this? What's your experience?
You're so right. It's just absolutely extraordinary that if you go to Wolverhampton, I don't know, some place that is really struggling, you will find the most beautiful buildings that have been boarded up. And it's simply because we're wedded to our cars, and we need to have a change in mindset around what property can do and how people can keep city centres on a 24/7 cycle. So I think in some ways the pandemic and the fact that we have this huge spanner going into the planning system in the UK, which is called Class E, it's challenging, but it could really shake things up, and they really need shaking up.
And I wonder, Simon, whether we will ever see the day when actually you require planning permission to demolish a building. Irrespective of what a proposal is. I mean, I made a prediction, well, about 15 years ago, that actually that will become a feature of the planning system, because you can't demolish a building in a conservation area, in a protected historic area in Britain. You have to have a planning permission for a replacement. But if it's not a protected area and you own a building, you can knock it down without asking anybody. This seems to me perverse. Simon.
Yes, I agree. I think this must come. And interesting enough, I mean, there are various battles going on in London, of which I'm involved in a couple, which revolves around knocking down buildings in order to build something bigger, or better, or shinier and newer. Now, I'm not kind of against new. In fact, I think we have to look to the future consistently and permanently. But I think the future is different to what we thought it was, if you like. And I think that what tends to happen is, of course, as developers buy sites in the expectation that they're going to get a big uplift, which means they've got to knock something down. And the design teams are not incentivized to look at the best and how possible, look at imaginative solutions to retaining and reusing existing buildings. I mean, I was very interested in Canny's scheme, because that exhibits exactly what I'm talking about. It's an ingenious and imaginative reuse of a building that does not look that promising initially, and I think it's that kind of level of ingenuity we've got to get involved with. I think architects have got to, as I said a bit earlier, I think have got to move away from the presumption that we get a chance to design something exciting and new every time. I think we have to think about, on the one hand, designing with existing buildings, but equally, I think, as I said as well, I think we have to design as if retrofit was the next thing that's going to happen to our building, one way or another, so that it is capable of future change. It's not so bespoke that it is. Yeah.
Do you not think that, I mean, architects don't have so many cards in their hands really at the moment? I think that our agency is quite diminished. And I think that what you said to me previously about the fact that sites are bought, as you said, on hope value, but there's an idea that, it's okay because the new building is going to last 120 years. But what do you say when you're facing a building on Oxford Street like Marks and Spencer's, and it survived very happily 90 years already and probably could do another 150? Like, where is the justification then? It's just because people think that they have a God-given right to more money from a site, and maybe it's not so much planning as tax. We need to tax people.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think that, the bizarre thing is that one of the justifications for knocking down a 90-year-old building that is capable of lasting, in the case of Marks and Spencer on Oxford Street, knocking down something that is 90 years old, but could be capable of lasting at least another 100, say, years, is that the new one is going to last 125 years. Well, that is sort of perverse thinking. I mean, why not continue with the building as it is? Now, it's my understanding that there are issues like, ceiling heights, but this is what we have to get used to. We have to be imaginative and figure out how to reuse these buildings. I mean, it's been used quite happily for 90 years. I'm sure there's justification for, there must be a good case to be made with ingenuity for reusing these buildings and recycling them. That's not to say you can't extend them or make the most of them. Of course, we should be doing that. But I think
I suppose there are sort of two ideas at work here. One is sort of a cultural idea about how we should think about economy in its broadest sense, which by and large architects have been rather good at. The other one is about science and calculation. I mean, I suppose that, let's say, if you think you needed more housing in London, and you take any existing site and an existing building, and you say you'll put 3 times as much space on it, but to do that, it needs to involve demolition. But on the other hand, it's a more economic use of scarce land, that if you had to build that on land outside the city, in other words, it's an argument for a more compact city. And the question therefore becomes, well, in the case of residential, could you ensure as best you can that what you're designing will last as long as Georgian housing? And surely we ought to be able to do that. So my question to both of you is, do you think that there can be a sort of reconciliation between the cultural attitude to willy-nilly demolition being crazy, but also an embrace of science which says, well, actually, it's reasonable to do this sort of thing in these circumstances?
I mean, can I just pick up there? I think the science of commercial buildings now, everybody knows it's a moving target. We're not really talking about raised floors in the same way because, you know, technology has changed and the way that we move around the city has changed. In the terms of housing, and I just think we really need to remember that the city is a project which is in the making. It's always in the making. So we don't get to this place on a whiteboard where we say there's a binary choice. Either we listen to the science or we get sort of sentimental. We get to the point where we say, right, the Carpenter's estate, it's been empty. A lot of people have lost, time there. There's 24,000 people on the new and waiting list. So there is a cost to kind of withdrawing from building fabric, leaving it out in the cold, and then trying to either re-energize that fabric or densify it or rebuild. And these kind of things, they're not short amounts of time in the greater scheme of things against the life of a building even. You know, we need to start thinking more incrementally and keep occupation and improve things in ways which always adds value.
Yeah, I mean, we have
Simon, can I ask a sort of, it's a sort of supplementary to that, which is to ask whether, I mean, many architects really dislike, I think almost emotionally, the idea of converting buildings without having to get planning permission. In other words, permitted development, you know, subject to certain safeguards in respect of minimum space and light standards. But assuming that they exist, would you be broadly in favour of having actually the reuse of a redundant building is a social good and not a planning evil?
Yeah, I would say that's probably a fair point. I mean, I think that, you know, the rate at which we are extracting material out of the surface of the earth is exceeding by quite a long way either both GDP and population growth. So we're using up resources at a faster rate, and we have to bring that down. Otherwise, we have no chance of meeting 1.5, let alone 2 degrees centigrade temperature increase. And to do that, we have to reuse. I mean, you know, I absolutely agree that we need to build new, but we have to try and be as resource efficient in building new, and to demolish perfectly usable buildings. I'm not saying that they're not necessarily ideally economic or whatever, but to demolish usable building is not helpful in this overall thing. It just increases the need to dig more resources out of as I say, the surface of the planet, and that is problematic. You know, even if you use zero carbon diggers, the mere fact of digging holes in the ground releases carbon dioxide. So, you know, the message is avoid doing it if you can. But I think we have to harness not only retrofit, but I think we have to harness the ingenuity inherent in architects. I think that, I think there's a really amazing there's amazing opportunities for architects if they can, embed themselves into this thinking, and design for climate change. There's also, and I think if I use the example of Kodak, there wasn't a shop on the planet you couldn't buy a reel of Kodak film in the last century. Now you can't get anywhere. And the reason was they didn't get with the change to digital. And I think the same applies to architects and people who produce buildings, that if they don't sort of understand the issues of climate change, those businesses will suffer the same fate as Kodak or Blockbuster Video or any of them.
Thank you very much. Maybe a final thought from you, Canny, as a practicing architect and a specifying architect. Do you think we've gone far enough in allowing designers to understand the carbon implications of the materials that they're specifying or proposing?
No, I don't think that's. I agree. There's some catch up to do. There's also some sense in which very influential practices like Foster's need to look at their production and see where are they leading us, because some architects have more agency than others. And picking up on what Simon just said, I would say developers and councils and governments need to think very carefully about how they incentivize reuse and retrofit.
Well, that's a good note to end on, I think, because, I mean, designers cannot surely be expected to take entire responsibility for this. This is going to be a task for all concerned. I mean, governance, both national and local, and from the commercial world also. And clearly there are signs of that combination working in terms of ESG requirements, reporting requirements of public companies. There is at least the start of a trajectory. So Simon Sturgis and Canny Ash, thank you very much for your contribution today. It's been lively.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.